Good morning, Team Krulak community, and on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Krulak Center, and Marine Corps University Foundation, welcome back to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine War with our Russia expert, Dr. Yuval Weber. I know this is, we're in episode number 10 now of this special series, and as we were just talking about, we're hoping to sort of pick up the tempo now that our own academic year responsibilities will lift. They will be lighter here over the next couple of weeks, so we can get back to more regular updates to everybody. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer here at the Krulak Center, and so we're just going to get right into it. Yuval, good to see you back here again. You and I, we both came back recently from first overseas trip for Team Krulak in a while, which kind of ties into our first topic. We went over to Stockholm, Sweden, to the Swedish Defense University to be present as well as to present some things at the Northern Initiative Future Military Leaders Conference. And we went there, and it was looking like Sweden and Finland were going to formally apply to join the NATO alliance. And Yuval, you gave your talk, and when we left, they were formally applying. So good job, great talk.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
What I have done. Yeah, that was the final thing that really tied the room together there for the NATO alliance. So, but obviously, like this is that's a huge sea change, for those individual countries in their respective security postures, but also a big sea change to, assuming they go through the accession in a smooth fashion, that really changes the security dynamic for that entire region. So maybe we'll start with that. What does it mean for these two countries, and what does it do for the overall NATO security posture?
So certainly, and pleasure to be with you, Ian. So I think, over the past month, there's been a lot of news, but in fact, the origin story of Finland and Sweden going into, or at least applying for NATO accession, the Turks at this point have what NATO parlance is, they've broken the silence. One of the things I've learned over the past couple of weeks is the way that NATO actually works is there's an assumption of consensus. Whenever there's a particular military or political idea or policy brought forth, and it's up to the individual states to, quote unquote, break the silence and to lodge an objection. And the Turks have lodged an objection, identifying this as a particularly opportune moment to extract various other concessions from NATO and the United States, as well as Finland and Sweden. So what the Turks want, before we sort of launch into eventually this will all be resolved. There's no indications that that the Turkish objections are permanent. But what Germany wants from Sweden and Finland is to be less friendly to PKK, which is the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is considered by the state of Turkey to be a terrorist group. And many of its leaders and supporters are in exile in places such as Sweden and Finland. And in Sweden and Finland, the armed wing of the party is considered to be a terrorist group, but the unarmed wing, the actual political faction, is considered to be any other political grouping. In the same way that Sinn Féin, within Ireland, Northern Ireland, that's a terrorist party or terrorist organization for many years, but it also has a political wing. So same sort of idea there. So what the Turks want is Sweden in particular to be less friendly to the PKK. They also want various other laundry lists. They want access to the F-35 from the United States, because that's the future sort of standard plane of NATO forces. They also want various economic inducements, so on and so forth. Eventually, some resolution will be found. Assuming that all happens, what happens for Finland, Sweden? What happens for that region? And as you laid out, this is going to be a sea change, as it were, for the entire region. Because if and when Finland and Sweden do enter into NATO, several major things will happen effectively immediately. One is that Russia currently has an Arctic border with only Norway, and I believe it's only 20 to 30 kilometers across.
Yeah, it's very narrow.
It's very narrow. And so it's when thinking about, Finland, Sweden, Norway, these are relatively, they're not very wide countries, but they are very essentially tall countries in a certain sense. But where Russia and NATO actually meet is only where Norway sort of curves around the top of Sweden. And so obviously Russian forces are massed there to prevent any sort of NATO invasion. If Finland comes in, suddenly NATO's borders or Russia's borders with NATO more than triple, several hundred more kilometers. The Finns have roughly 250,000 active duty troops. They have 900,000 troops in their reserves. And so suddenly a potential invasion of Russia from Finland, or rather potential defense of NATO from Russia, is suddenly in the realm of up to 900,000 plus soldiers plus whatever Sweden is going to provide, and that just makes the security situation for Russia that much more difficult just on the land basis. On the sea basis, having Finland and Sweden in NATO means that the Baltic Sea effectively becomes a NATO lake. And that means the ability to interdict surface shipping as well as submarines becomes much greater for NATO. And obviously, Russia's ability to operate in those waters, relatively shallow waters, becomes that much more difficult. And so therefore, Russia's ability to get to the Atlantic Ocean becomes much more circumscribed. And then when thinking about the Arctic, the high north, obviously, if there's going to be greater NATO nuclear weapons coverage, there's clearly, on some level, going to be the hardening of Finnish, Swedish, and then the rest of Norwegian defenses in the high north to protect there. That'll become much more difficult for Russia in case of conflict to get its shipping out of Murmansk in the Arctic Ocean, out into the North Atlantic, and beyond. So really, Putin's strategic genius here has created a much more difficult security situation for Russia by land, by the Baltic Sea, and in the Arctic Ocean and into the high north. And so what we can expect is that whatever happens to Russia in this Ukraine war, they're going to have to spend a tremendous amount over the next generation just to get to a place where they were before this war in those areas. So really, Russia is creating the exact situation that it claimed it wanted to avoid in these regions. And the other sort of political thing that we found out, or sort of like we've been tracking over the course of this conflict, is that this was completely 100% driven by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And for this, the Finnish people that we were speaking to, and certainly what the Finnish president has been saying, is that in effect, if Russia's willing to do this to their Slavic brothers, people ostensibly that they like, they'd be willing to do this to anybody for any reason, whenever it suited them. Finland used to be a part of the Russian Empire, and if Russia wanted to regain all of its imperial possessions, not just the former Soviet ones, then obviously the Finland would be one of the highest ones next on that list. So as soon as the war started, the Finnish president started working with American counterparts, coming to Washington, going to Sweden, essentially creating the entire coalition of NATO states so that by the time they actually applied for NATO accession, they had commitments from all 30 members of NATO. The Turks are just using this moment, while the going is good, try to get something out of it. So in terms of politically, this was caused by the invasion. The Finns spent the next 3 months creating the coalition. The Swedes didn't want to be left alone. And the result will be a much more difficult security environment for Russia.
Yeah, and I think it's from our admittedly we were only out there for a week, but in the conversations what we saw, it came apparent, at least to me, that not only does this change the geographic challenge for Russian force posture, but in terms of the capabilities those two countries potentially bring into the alliance, like they're just because they were neutral doesn't mean that they were not prepared or that they don't have capable militaries. I think they're one of the themes from that week we were there was like functionally in terms of assets and capability, and especially interoperability potentially with NATO forces. They're essentially ready to go at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And you have very high levels of talking about the NATO Sea. I remember one conversation I had with a Finnish naval officer talking about, how they look at naval mines as a strategic weapon. That if you're going to use mines in a strategic fashion, that, the Baltic area and those littorals is quite the place to do it. They've hugely complicated. Russia's hugely complicated its own problem because now they have a longer border to defend, and they just got two very capable militaries off the fence and not on their team.
Right. And when we were there, I asked basically all the Swedish officers one question and all the Finnish officers another question. So the question to the Finnish officers is, what have you learned over the past 3 months? And the consistent theme was, we have observed, in effect, what Ukraine is doing is first assuming they're not going to have air superiority, limited air coverage at best, which is the core assumption of how Finland assumes its potential future war against Russia to be. So their view was the Ukrainians have done very well, thus validating Finland's own strategic assumptions. And their view was, if the Ukrainians are able to do what they've been able to do without basically Finnish like financial and actual like military capabilities, resources,
Yeah.
then Finland is feeling pretty good that it's going to be a net security provider to NATO. And that was basically what they've learned from Ukraine. What I asked the Swedish officers, because Sweden obviously doesn't share a border with Russia, and interestingly, we learned that perhaps Finland and Sweden have the closest relationship of any two countries in the world, because Sweden has been neutral for a very long time, but their view is the security environment has changed. And when going back to first principles, the first principle is we cannot do anything without Finland. Therefore, if the Finns are in this situation, it is more important for us to be with Finland than to maintain, a 200-year tradition of neutrality, which is interesting.
Yeah.
So I then asked the Swedish officers, same question, or a different question, but all of them the same question, which is, if Sweden is going to make 2% of spending, and that's already gone through their political process, so that's already done, what are you going to do with that money? And the basic response was, we're going to increase the size of the armed forces through conscription, not so much to create a larger standing army, but we need to create a far, far larger reserve army. So in that regard, we need to have the next couple of years of people learning the basic skills of both combat, medicine, civil defense, things of that nature, so that if and when the war comes, we're going to have, if not 900,000 like the Swedes, but we'll have a few 100,000 people who are in the reserves, ready to go, and with the equipment that they need to support Finland in forestalling or defending invading from Russia. And that to me seemed to be a really smart way of thinking about it. They're not thinking, what are like all the gizmos that we can get from, various countries, but what is the one thing that we're afraid of? Finland being invaded by Russia. Therefore, how can we best support that? And that seemed to be at least in terms of the setup, a really good use of the financial resources they're going to commit to increasing defense capabilities.
Yeah, no, that's that's an interesting point, because that I'll slight tangent here, and then we'll go on to the next theme. But that was actually part of what I was asked to come talk to their air warfare department about, in terms of air power for the small nation, and what the challenge of when you are fiscally constrained. What are your choices now? Through a series of case studies, one of the things that we sort of explored in this was that the resource constraint actually focuses thinking really well, in a way that the United States is a much larger power with a larger economic base to draw from. We to put it charitably, we don't have to do that focused thinking, because we can just when it comes to air power, but this also applies to arguably like how you structure your land forces, your naval forces. We'll throw money at everything, right? We can get every type, model, series of aircraft, lots of different ships. We can have a big land army, and then we can have a Marine Corps that's bigger than the land armies of some other countries. And we can have all these things, right? when you can't just have all those things, it really focuses your attention on what is the key thing, what is the most important. And I think as you described, Sweden has decided that the most important thing for their resources is, joint effort with their neighbor, their traditional neighbor, and their I don't know how you would describe close cousins, fraternal brother sister thing, but that has really focused their choice on what they're doing.
Yeah, so I'd ask people like, what explains this particular closeness before I have an even like further tangent on, resource scarcity and making good decisions. But I asked the Finns and Swedes, what explains the closeness? Where Sweden's really about to give up a tremendous amount of sovereignty for the sake of its relations with Finland. And their effective answer was, obviously we have similar cultures, our languages are different. But one of the things is that Finland used to be a part of Sweden. Obviously, when Sweden was a much larger, imperial country before they
Yeah.
lost some wars to Russia, as it were. But because empires work on sort of heterogeneity, that lots of different parts of the empire have different relations to the center, the Russian Empire, in effect, allowed the Finns to keep almost the entirety of their domestic laws. Obviously, they had to pay, their tribute. They had to, state tribute to St. Petersburg. In those days, that was the capital. They had to
Yeah.
quarter Russian troops, so forth. But fundamentally, Sweden was self-governing. Finland's laws at that time were in effect the Swedish imperial laws, so that when the Russian Empire collapsed and then there was the Bolshevik Revolution, Finland then restored its basically like its own laws, which were the Swedish laws, which allowed for basically this seamless cultural, social, legal integration with Sweden, even if they kept the actual country separate. And so that was a way that, Finland has really been, even from the time of, being a part of Russia, in effect, still culturally and legally and socially part of a larger Scandinavia. And that's what the Russian Empire didn't end. And during the time of, the various wars and then the Cold War, they didn't change that at all. And just one more note about like resource scarcity. So when I did my PhD dissertation, the whole thing was about how do resource booms and busts of petrostates, like Soviet Union and Russia is obviously what I studied, but
Yeah.
like also places like Norway, Iran, etc. The key thing that I found was when countries have core national interests, those don't change no matter how little or how much money they have. They'll always have that. But when there are good times, they basically do much dumber things, which were previously not possible because they didn't have the money. So the money comes in, they go on totally optional adventures. Then when the money's run out, they're like, oh, we have all these diplomatic commitments that are no longer possible. So when you have, and that's the same logic as when you have countries that assume resource scarcity, they're simply going to not make, or it's going to be much more difficult to make bad decisions because they know they don't have the money for it. So I think, so in effect, countries always know their interests. It's whether they make good or bad decisions is whether they think, their financial situation is going to be stable or not.
Yeah, and between understanding one's own financial situations as well as understanding or not understanding the cultural, historical affinities between different peoples, I just the future recession of now Finland and Sweden into NATO is just another example of, I think, just Putin operating, looking at the world in a way that is just uh, does not see or does not internalize these things that arguably should have been apparent, especially at, like, your neighbors best. You would argue, you'd think that sort of, and with historical Russian influence over that region as well, that their reaction might be understood or predictable, but no, went to war to keep NATO from expanding, and here we are. So again, good job. All right. Yeah. So I think we're gonna, so for the purposes of strengthening of the NATO alliance, we could look at as a potential future good news story, in terms of, democratic countries standing together against non-democratic authoritarian regimes and sort of putting putting their money where their mouth is about it. Switching back to the actual war itself going on in Ukraine over the last few weeks, there have been some battlefield shifts back and forth, but as we were talking about before we hit record, not as much of a good news story there, if you will. And so I think in the last few weeks since we talked, we've seen a combination of Russian withdrawal and Ukrainian counterattacks around Kharkiv, which is up in the sort of the northeastern part of the contested regions. And there was a feel-good moment there where you had some Ukrainian soldiers who had pushed all the way to the Russian border, and they put a little Ukrainian like border marker there. As a morale booster, sure, that's a great moment. But looking down to the further to the east and further to the south in the more eastern Donbas region, the picture is getting less optimistic. I don't want to say it's totally pessimistic, but we've been seeing some changes in how Russian forces have been operating, as well as we're seeing a tactical situation now where the battlefield challenges have shifted from complicated for the Russian side to complicated and hard choices for the Ukrainian side. The Russian side was complicated, the initial invasion, when they pushed along multiple axes that are hard to support anyway logistically. They didn't do a good job of supporting them on the best of days. They exposed their forces to piecemeal destruction and huge attritional losses to the point where they had to pull back. They had to abandon trying to encircle Kyiv. They had to abandon Kharkiv. But now they are going in a more concentrated fashion in the Donbas region. It looks like they're not attempting these massive encirclements, but more smaller bite-sized pieces, which would be easier for them to sustain logistically. But also, this brings the traditional Russian strengths that everyone is like, we haven't seen them yet. Well, now we're starting to see it, which is just mass raw firepower over small areas, which is very hard to simply stand and take for any military, good or bad. And so now there's some tough choices on the Ukrainian side in terms of, do they attempt to hold in the face of these smaller but intense pushes supported by huge amounts of firepower, or do they look at trading space to preserve their forces, which then means they have to give up Ukrainian territory and potentially Ukrainian people to the Russians. And we know what the Russians are going to do to those places that they go and occupy. Nothing good. So I guess if you want to expand on sort of that overall view of how things have developed there and what this means now for this phase of the war and how this potentially plays out here over the coming months.
Yeah, thanks. And it's a good setup, and it may be useful to it is as we're discussing May 27th, to think basically. Let's start at the end and work our way to the present. So at the conclusion, so how is this war going to end? Eventually, there will be some sort of. It's unlikely. Let's just put it this way: that Russia will completely militarily defeat Ukraine all the way through. We have a sense of that because the Ukrainians have been fighting well, morale is high. They have gotten, at this point, a huge number of military resources, and they're about to get at minimum $40 billion more. And it's, part of that is Lend-Lease, part of that is, the military aid from the United States, and part of that is just going to be all the other stuff that comes from other, basically Western countries that do not want basically Russia to win or Ukraine to lose. It's also, Ukraine is probably not going to get the amount of international support if it tries to go beyond removing Russia from most of its territory except for Crimea. So we have a general sense of what the end of the war looks like, is that Russia is out of Ukraine except for Crimea, and that's the basis for negotiations. But what sort of ceasefire negotiations, what does the actual diplomacy look like? That's what's being fought over right now. In what position of strength or weakness is each of the sides? And in this, when you raise the question of, Russia's finally fighting according to its doctrine by having massive fires in order to then, artillery, bombardment, things of that nature, to then essentially introduce infantry, introduce armor, armor vehicles, things of that nature. is that going to be successful enough to basically get Ukraine to consider itself being in a position of weakness? And that, is the question that I think we'll return to more or less every week, as we do these, once, twice a week for the rest of, hopefully not the rest of our lives, but ostensibly over the rest of the summer, is, how to put it, is Russia being more effective in smaller areas sufficient to get Russia to win this war? Is Ukraine going to lose this war by losing smaller areas, smaller settlements, and allowing the front line to move forward at a very slow pace? But then also at the same time, Ukraine is also developing, its own reserves. It's getting more weapons, so it's going to be able to move, the front line more towards Russia. So we can see that over the course of this summer, this is going to resemble something like World War I, in which there's a clear front line on both sides, and they're basically pushing each other back and forth over the same distances. That, sometimes it goes a couple kilometers towards the rest of Ukraine, and then it gets reversed, and perhaps there's a counteroffensive that moves it closer towards Russia. It gets reversed. There's another offensive, and they're just going to grind away at each other. So that's a marker that we should put down, is, does the settling of a line of conflict between the two sides actually help create the conditions for a ceasefire and thus political discussions rather than battlefield discussions? What we also know is that, again, over the course of this summer, we're going to see what the extent of, questions that we've asked over the past couple of months, and we're getting into, I think, month 4 at this point, is who's going to rearm first, and what is the resilience of the Russian economy? At this point, Russia is, taking the second question first, or second point first, Russia's not in a good place. They're not in a good place because at this point, half their reserves are frozen abroad. They started this war with, roughly speaking, like in their own possession, roughly 323 billion US dollars in basically all the different bank accounts. The Ministry of Finance just released its first data since the beginning of the war, and they have at this point roughly 265 billion. So over the first 3 months of conflict, they spent about $60 billion. They get, in terms of, basically energy revenues from selling the stuff abroad, roughly speaking, $2 billion a week. They're spending just on the war $1 billion a week. If and when, and this is, part of the discussions we've had across Europe over the past couple of weeks, is that Europe getting off Russian energy, both oil and natural gas, in various stages, seems to be happening by the end of this year. The burn rate of Russian cash is, 2 billion a week. They're getting a billion. They have 265 more to go. That means that they can continue this war for what? Another year and a half. If and when that energy revenue money starts to decline, the burn rate will go much faster. And once the burn rate goes to be much faster, where they're essentially not making a profit per week, this is where we start to get into the idea of a bank run. Not like a literal bank run, where people are outside, well, that might happen too, but a bank run in terms of the idea that within Russia, the future doesn't look bright. And if the future doesn't look bright, then people, at high levels, regions, enterprises, individuals start making the following calculations with themselves. Does the future look as bright tomorrow as it does today? And once people start saying no, they start to take self-interested decisions instead of thinking what is going to be best for President Putin, what is going to be best for the Russian Federation, what is going to be best for the war effort. And that's where the domestic politics of Russia will start to become determinative in how long Russia can sustain this war. Those are the issues that happened basically in World War I for Russia. And what I personally am looking for over the course of this summer is, when you ask the question, are the Ukrainians going to try and hold? Are they going to try and trade like land for time? what my personal sort of like, just let's say wager at the beginning of summer is that they're going to try and hold as much as possible in order to increase the burn rate of basically Russian cash, so that by the time we get to the end of summer, Russia is facing resource constraints that they have not faced in many, many years. And that's going to be the position in which then the weapons come from abroad from the Ukrainian side, and they seek to then retake their territory and make that counteroffensive the centerpiece of how they want to get to the negotiating table. Again, lots of other scenarios can happen, but it seems to be that's what the Ukrainian strategy is right now. And thus, Russia's strategy is, if we don't win by the end of summer, we're going to be in a world of hurt. So we can expect a lot more violence over the next couple of months as both sides try to basically not lose.
Great. Well, not great, but at least we got a stake in the sand now to start measuring against as the summer unfolds. I know, looking at the clock, we got to wrap up here shortly, but I'd like to do maybe one real quick take here on something else we had talked about, which may actually manifest itself about the same time over the summer. And one of the discussion points here was possibility of direct Western involvement, and this is specifically about the impact of lost grain exports coming out of Ukraine. There's been I've seen a few things in terms of some countries being very firm that they're not gonna buy or go around or allow any sort of third party distribution by Russian attempts to remove the grain. But on the flip side, there's been satellite imagery of Russia loading up that grain onto their ships. They want to try and get it out because they know that grain is quite important. In fact, vital for a lot of other countries who depend on that. And there's been concern, I think, from the United Nations and other sort of more global organizations that there's the potential for a real food supply crunch here because of the disruptions caused by the war. And we don't really know yet, I think, how that's going to shape out or how bad it could be. But Ukraine supplies a not insignificant amount of a vital staple to globally. And the loss of that is going to start applying some pressures in multiple directions. Potentially pressures on Russia to, more pressure from Western countries to get them to stop the war, but also now potentially Russia has a lever that they can use and be like, let our ships through or people starve, right? Like, what do you want to do? And then if the decision is let the ships through, that opens up a possible, fission point for the application of sanctions. So what's your sort of quick take on that situation?
Yeah, so I think it reminds me of two things that we've been tracking over the course of the conflict. One is that the Ukrainians are fighting fairly well. So when they basically reach the limits of their military capabilities, they basically start asking for what is the next most lethal thing. And so in that regard, just in terms of this conflict, the next thing that they're asking for is the multiple launch rocket systems in order to essentially create greater distance in terms of where they can start to fight the Russians, provide a bit more cover. The second thing, and this is related directly to the question, I have started to see the various suggestions, at minimum, is that the impending food crisis in Russia, which you noted, Putin has said very explicitly, if sanctions are relaxed, the grain gets through. So he's willing to blackmail basically global starvation to relax sanctions on his country. So that's what we're talking about. Vladimir Putin, lover of human life. The counterpart to that is, as I've started to see for the first time over maybe the past week or so, as the issue is becoming more acute, particularly in Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, it's obviously Central Asia as well, is that what if, and here we can start to see the beginning of the what if, which we've seen many times over this conflict. What if the West were to provide armed naval convoys to help basically get this grain out? What if, Ukraine can get more of this grain away from rail, away on rail, but could they go to the port of Odessa to basically start to unload to alleviate the future humanitarian crisis. Now, the Pentagon explicitly said, I think it was earlier this week or was it last week, that that's not going to happen. President Biden has been pretty clear. The United States is not going to intervene militarily in a direct way into this conflict. What if the calculations change? If we're starting to see starvation, like in Kenya, if we're starting to see provincial disturbances in Egypt, what if we're starting to see a resource conflict between, let's say, Pakistan and India over basically dwindling grain supplies? Those are all questions that basically will then get put against what are the costs and benefits of sending, even if not US ships, but let's say other NATO ships or other ships from, at this point, still like neutral third parties to get that grain. It's unclear, but it's clear that this issue, which has been identified from the beginning of the conflict, is now reaching the acute phase. And the difficult decisions of basically how many people need to starve, how many governments need to fall for basically Putin to try to get his way, that's coming up right now. And so we don't have the answer, but we certainly have the contours of asking that same question over the course of this summer.
Yeah, and I was noting down here that that raises the potential maybe for Turkey to be an even wilder wild card in there because, going through the Bosphorus, that's one way to get the grain out. And, they have things they want addressed for other parts of NATO operations that we talked about at the very beginning here. So again, yeah, don't really have an answer, but there's a lot of the future is murky in a lot of ways. And I think we're the manifestation of something is, it might seem relatively benign in terms of where your grain comes from. That's not going to be benign for a while because we do still live in a very globally interconnected economy where things going on in one place can have, ripple effects elsewhere. And I was actually thinking this might be something that we could bring Dr. Rosella Capella-Zielinski back on because this is one of her areas of expertise. She's talked about this sort of more historical context in past episodes, but she probably have some good information to provide. So if she's listening, you might get an invitation here shortly to bring you back on with Yuval here and maybe revisit this specific issue as it starts potentially approaching an acute point.
So for those viewers who are not familiar with Dr. Capella-Zielinski, she and her co-author Paul Post, she is from, I think, Boston University or Boston College, one of those two, the one that I always forget which one. But her co-authors from University of Chicago, and they're working on a book, and we were privileged to have a broadcast with her a number of months ago, and the book is about wartime logistics and supply chains, and it focused a lot on, in World War I in particular, but it focused a lot on international cooperation, on the issue of who gets what grain, when, and how. So quite literally, this is a question that the countries of the world grappled with almost 100 years ago. So, or a bit more, yeah, almost 100 years ago. So we definitely need to bring her on to discuss that in greater detail.
Yeah. So, Dr. Zielinski, consider this your warning order, I guess. You'll be hearing from me shortly. All right. Well, I think we kind of got through the things we wanted to talk about, and I know you got other obligations here shortly. So, Yuval, good to get you back on here, and to our audience, we will look to resume sort of a more regular tempo here as we go into the summer months. And as you heard here today, this is still a very dynamic conflict. There are lots of different factors at play, and now there are things coming more into play that were not necessarily as significant at the beginning, but now those things are going to start to be felt. So we will certainly have a lot to talk about and discuss. So, all right, Yuval, good to see you again. I will get this out here as quickly as I can, and have yourself a good long weekend.
You too. Take care, and happy birthday, Brie.
Yes. We got a tornado just for her.
Yeah.